Hello and welcome to this lecture on population ecology. It's from chapter 4 in the textbook. Start out by just discussing briefly the levels of ecological organization. There are, in this uh, table, 5 levels of ecological organization. We can start from the bottom and think about the organismal level, right? At the organismal level, we're talking about one individual living thing, right? So the science of ecology describes the relationships between organisms and their physical environments. So they're organisms in temperature or organisms in water needs, etc. So that's kind of what's going on there. It's kind of almost like a study of physiology of the organism. Population ecology is where you have a group of individuals of a certain species that live in a particular area. So this is, you know, a herd of deer in a particular state park, right? All of them are the same species, live in that same area, etc. We're in population ecology, kind of investigating the quantitative dynamics of how individuals within a species interact with one another. And we'll be talking a little bit more about this idea of population ecology in this lecture. Community ecology is basically more than one species of interacting living things, right, that live in a particular area. So it's sets of populations. And um, ecosystems, the idea of an ecosystem is both all the living organisms, right, but also the non-living parts as well. So again, interactions with weather and temperature and water, minerals, nutrients, those sort of things. And the biosphere is the sum total of all living things on Earth, and the habitats are areas they inhabit. Talk a little bit again about habitat, niche, and degree of specialization, which are all important ideas in organismal ecology. I think you know what a habitat is. You've been studying that for a while. Habitats are the specific environment where an organism lives, including the living and non-living elements that it requires. The habitat selection then is the process by which organisms choose habitats among the options that they encounter. Now, a new idea may be this idea of niche. Niche is an organism's functional role in a community. So it's beyond the idea of just the habitat. It's including things such as how they feed, the flow of energy and matter through them, and their interactions with other organisms. It's a very broad idea, right? So it's use of resources and its functional role within the ecosystem. Now we can say that there are degrees of specialization within organisms, right? Some organisms have very specific requirements, right, for their habitat, and their niche is very specialized. So they have a narrow breadth within their requirements. A panda bear is a good example. Only really has one food item it can live on, so it needs to be within, in those areas where that food supply is there. Other organisms, maybe like a coyote, have very broad uh, needs. They can survive in a lot of different ecosystems, and so they're more generalists and specialists. All right, let's talk about population ecology a little bit. Remember, a population is a group of individuals of a species that live in a particular area, and populations exhibit characteristics that help predict their dynamics. When I say dynamics, we're talking about the changes in populations over time. Okay. First of all, population size, population density, population distribution, sex ratio, age structure, and birth and death rates. So we're going to look at these 6 characteristics in the next few slides when we're discussing population ecology. Okay, so let's start. Obviously, population size is the number of individual organisms present at a given time. An example here is the passenger pigeon, now extinct, but was once one of North America's most populous, numerous birds. Right, its population size, the number of individual organisms, was very, very high. Now, population density is another way to look at population, and population density is talking about the population of organisms, the number of organisms, or the population size per unit area, right? Per acre or per kilometer squared, or per meter squared, or per centimeter squared, depending on the organism and the size. And again, the passenger pigeon had very high population density within those flocks. We can also talk about population distribution or population dispersion within an ecosystem. And the population distribution can be categorized in three ways. So there's three sort of spatial arrangements that we see in nature. And those three arrangements are random, which you see at the top, right, in the tree species, uniform, which is the example with the penguins, and clumped down at the bottom with the school of fish. When we're studying populations, we also are interested in the sex ratio, the ratio of males to females in a population, or a proportion of males to females, and even ratios, which are 50-50, right, near 50-50 are most common, and in general, fewer females in a population causes slower population growth. Sex ratio can be combined together with the age structure to give us an idea of how the population will change in the future. The age structure describes the relative numbers of organisms of each age within a population. So we can classify them, put them into age classes. Age structure diagrams, or age pyramids, show this information. If the pyramid is weighted toward young, there's more young than older, the population is still growing. If the pyramid is weighted toward the older side, right, older age classes, then the population is declining. Here's some examples. On the far left, your left, that population is increasing rapidly. There's a lot of organisms in that pre-reproductive age and reproductive age. And as you go across, you can see the next population over is increasing slowly. The third population over is stable, and the last population has very few organisms in the pre-reproductive age compared to the post-reproductive age, and that population is actually decreasing over time. Note also that you can, on these age structure pyramids, there is also information on the sex ratio for each age classification. The males on one side and the females on the other side, so there's a line dividing the age structure. So populations may grow, shrink, or remain stable. We can see that when we look at those population age structure diagrams. Now, the four factors that determine whether or not a population is growing, shrinking, or remaining stable are births, deaths, immigration into an area, and emigration away from an area. Right? Those four factors determine if the population is growing, shrinking, or remaining stable. The growth rate equals the birth rate plus the immigration rate minus the death rate plus the emigration rate. Now, unregulated populations increase by what's called exponential growth. Okay, growth by a fixed percentage rather than a fixed amount. And when a population undergoes or increases by this fixed percentage each year, it is said to undergo exponential growth. And this is similar to growth In a savings account, in this example, you can see 5% annual compound interest. Here's exponential growth in a actual population. Organisms, this is Scots pine. The exponential growth is shown in pollen accumulation. We can see within grams per centimeter squared per year over the course of about 500 years, and you can see that population is increasing at a set rate, and that growth curve, that J-shaped curve, is a characteristic of exponential growth. Limiting factors. Limiting factors restrain population growth. They slow the growth rate. Okay? So every population is eventually contained by limiting factors, which are physical, chemical, and biological characteristics of the environment. The interaction of the limiting factors determines the carrying capacity. Okay? Carrying capacity, right, is the maximum population size of a given species that a particular environment can sustain. Now that'll change over time because environments are constantly changing, right? Environments are dynamics. So what you have then is you have initial exponential growth when an organism comes into a new environment. That growth, you see that J-shaped curve, and then you have that growth rate start to slow and then start to stabilize at the carrying capacity. This is called a logistic growth curve. Okay? Here's an example of a logistic growth curve. So you can see that the population size increases, it's growing exponentially, it starts to slow down near carrying capacity, and eventually stays there at carrying capacity for the population. Now the limiting factors, right, those limiting factors such as the physical, chemical, and biological characteristics, right? Examples here are water, space, food, predators, disease. We can categorize these limiting factors all as environmental resistance. Okay, so that's a kind of a catch-all for all the different limiting factors that occur. Here's another example of logistic growth. These are yeast cells growing in a culture in a lab over the course of less than a day, and the population size is the number of cells, and you can see it grows exponentially at first, starts to taper off, and reaches the carrying capacity. A few more growth curves that we can look at. Here is an example of a mite, a very small spider-like organism, tick-like organism, and you can see this is an oscillating growth curve. It goes up quickly at first, but it then goes up and down, up and down, up and down over time, and it never really settles at the carrying capacity. We would probably have to take an average here to get a carrying capacity over time, so it might be somewhere around 3,000 if we were to think about just sort of taking an average eyeballing it. Some growth curves will do this. They'll start out with like this beetle here, it'll start out with very big oscillations right between population size over time, each generation, and then it will slowly get closer and closer into more precise numbers around the carrying capacity. So that's called a dampening. It dampens over time. The oscillations become smaller. Some populations will do what you might call a crash, the population growth curve. So here is a group of reindeer introduced to a small island off the southwest coast of Alaska when 26 reindeer were introduced in 1910. There's a lot of food on the island, right? Lichens and mosses and other food sources were plentiful. But by 1935 or so, the herd's population had soared to 2,000. So it had overshot the island's carrying capacity. This led to a population crash with the herd plummeting to only 8 reindeer in 1950, by 1950. So that's a crashing population curve. So the overshoot was so extensive, the food sources was depleted, and the population crashed. Population's density can increase or decrease the impact of certain limiting factors on that population. When that is the case, these are called density dependent factors. Examples here are of density dependent factors are disease and predation. Okay? Now other factors such as catastrophic weather events, right? Those can be called density independent factors, right? Because they affect a population size regardless of its population densities. So floods, fires, hurricanes, unseasonable weather, habitat destruction, all those things are dependent on density of the population. So some limiting factors have a greater effect as population density increases. Okay, those are density dependent, and some are independent of density, and those are called density independent factors. All right. Last idea here is biotic potential and reproductive strategies, and these are going to vary among species, right? So some species all the species are going to have different biotic potentials and reproductive strategies. Species producing a lot of young, examples like insects, fish, frogs, and plants, have high biotic potential. Okay, so those organisms have a lot of offspring and um, very little parental care. Others, such as mammals and birds, produce very few young, but they give them a lot more care. Okay, so that biotic potential. That when we think of biotic potential, we can think of R-selected species and K-selected species. Okay, these are reproductive strategies. R-selected, that lowercase r, these are organisms, I guess we can say, like a fly, right? Flies. They have many offspring. They're very fast-growing, and they don't have limited to no parental care, right? These are selected species. So they can exploit opportunities quickly, but they have very high losses amongst the offspring. Now capital K, or K-selected species, right, have fewer offspring, slow-growing the organisms are, and they require a lot of parental care, so a lot of input of energy into raising, teaching, and caring for the offspring. Hence a higher survival rate of the offspring. Okay? R-selected species and K-selected species, you can kind of think of the fly and the elephant, right? The fly being an example of an R-selected species, and the elephant being an example of K-selected species. All right, that concludes our discussion of population ecology. And if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks.